To start this video off, my dear viewers, I have to confess to you a terrible sin against which I must pay penance. And I am mortified that I have done this, and this thing is in-depth analysis of Penitent Engines and Mortifiers for the Adepta Sororitas faction of Warhammer 40k that we're going to watch right now. Let's do it! What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're talking about some units from the Adepta Sororitas faction. These are Penitent Engines and Mortifiers. This is a topic that was requested by the Tactical Tortoise patrons over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. If you want to put your input into the next episode of Datasheet Deep Dive, you can do so by becoming a patron. Also, some other cool stuff is going on the channel right now. We just had 10,000 subscribers, and I'm currently running a giveaway for a fully fledged, in-the-flesh Tyranid battle force from the new set of battle forces. This is the Brood Swarm Kit, I think is what it's called, and you can enter to win it a bunch of different ways. Check out the link down in the description, and there's one over on the community tab of the channel. For the giveaway sign up, you can do things like subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow me on Twitter, follow the new Tactical Tortoise Twitch channel on twitch.tv/tacticaltortoisetv, and those will enter you to win the giveaway. There's a bunch of different ways to enter, and you can enter like a million times. You can also refer friends for additional entries. How cool is that? And I just mentioned it before, but also I've been doing a lot of streaming on Twitch. For the time being, I'm moving all of my streaming over to twitch.tv/tacticaltortoise, my new Twitch channel, off of YouTube for right now, although we are rebroadcasting some of the streams over to YouTube for people who want to see them. This is sort of on a trial period, so we're going to see how it goes for a couple weeks and determine whether or not the streaming will happen in the future on Twitch or on YouTube. So far, it's going great. We're trying to stream every single day, and it's been a really great time. So go ahead and follow us there so you get notified when we go live. Obviously, going live with all the normal content, live gameplay of 40k, as well as some commentated games from the community and from the T5S2 series. It's all a real fun time. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about these two big stompy robot things from Adepta Sororitas, the Mortifiers and the Penitent Engines. As always, with these datasheet deep dive videos, we're going to talk about each of these datasheets in depth, all their strengths and weaknesses, the way you want to use these units, and what they're good at on the tabletop, before moving on to cover some synergies that they have with the rest of the faction. Finally, for these two, I'm going to talk about two additional things using my very favorite tool ever, maths. We're going to talk about A, what are the melee weapons you should put on them, because they have two, what is the most optimal unit, whether if you are putting a unit of these guys in your army, whether it should be Mortifiers or Penitent Engines. Then, wrapping it all up, we're going to talk about a final verdict. Should you put that unit in your army, and if so, what do you do with it? So, let's just do it. So to start things off, let's talk about the classic of these two datasheets, the Penitent Engine. These things have been around forever. They've been a pretty cool model and kind of a fan favorite, I think. They are this big, stompy robot boy with a dude strapped to the front. They come in with a pretty hefty stat line. Strength 5, toughness 5, 5 wounds, 4 attacks. That's pretty good. Now, they are a vehicle, obviously, and they don't go through walls and all that stuff, so they're not going to be quite as maneuverable as infantry, despite having a pretty decent movement value of 7. Now, the unit itself comes in at 20 points. However, they have stapled to their profile 2 heavy flamers, each of which costs you 15 points. So for each Penitent Engine, you're going to be out a total of 50 points. They have 2 options of melee weapons, and one of the reasons that we're going to talk about these melee weapons back to each other is that both Penitent Engines and Mortifiers have the same melee weapon options available to them, so it's a very important question to ask yourself, and Penitent Engines specifically have some interesting abilities. First off, they have the Zealot rule, which gives them a full reroll to hit onto the first round of combat, which really helps because their weapon skill is only a 4+. Their ballistic skill is terrible, it's a 5+, but that does not matter because their only ranged weapon is a flamer, which automatically hits, so who cares. They also have this Berserk Killing Machine ability, which gives them a 5+ damage ignore roll all the time. That makes them relatively tanky. You can sort of assume that with 5 wounds and a 5+ damage ignore, they're almost in the realm of around 7 wounds on average. So that makes them difficult to kill. They are not the easiest. Now, only toughness 5 and a 4+ save does mean that they're going to be eating that damage a lot. So I wouldn't really put them on the table expecting them to survive, but they will be, I guess, surprisingly difficult to kill. Now, obviously, this is a melee unit through and through. They have almost no ranged attacks to speak of, and especially the heavy flamer option on these guys is sort of it's sort of a nothing weapon because they want to be moving up aggressively and attacking because most of their damage output comes from their melee attacks. If you want to charge an infantry unit, for example, and you shoot them with your flamers, you will probably fail your charge because you'll kill a lot of the units, the models that are closest to you, and then your charge will be more difficult. They're also not very long range, so you can't attack them with them outside of range. You can't advance and shoot with them because they're heavy. They're mostly, I think, going to be operated in a defensive capacity, and sometimes there'll be situations where you need to kill a bunch of infantry, and having heavy flamers on these guys will be helpful, but they're not really... You're probably not going to get more than 1 or 2 shots out of them. Now, moving over to the other datasheet we're talking about today, the Mortifier. Now, what's interesting about Penitent Engines is that they're missing a lot of stuff from Adepta Sororitas. Some of the strongest abilities in the entire faction are the fact that, A, like it has basically a universal vulnerable save, like everything in the faction has Shield of Faith, and Miracle Dice are incredible. But if you'll notice, Penitent Engines, there's a blank space here in their abilities section. It seems like maybe Shield of Faith was supposed to be in there, but it's not. So, they don't have Shield of Faith. They don't have Rites of Battle. They don't have any of that stuff. They also do not have the Adepta Sororitas keyword. Now, fortunately, Adepta Sororitas allows you to take the Adeptus Ministorum stuff in it without breaking detachment, so you can just bring them in an Adepta Sororitas detachment anyway. However, they basically don't benefit from any of the faction stratagems. There's one that allows you to use it on Penitent Engines, but other than that, they are basically unsupported, and also they're missing the Order keyword, which means that not only do they not get an Order benefit, but they also don't benefit from almost anybody's auras or things like a Canoness is not going to give them rerolls to hit, for example. They're not benefiting from an Imagifier aura. All of that stuff does not work on them. For the most part, Penitent Engines are acting unsupported. Now, moving on to the other version of this unit, the Mortifier. This one has less of those downsides, but it does pay some points for it. Mortifiers come in with almost exactly the same base stat line as a Penitent Engine. Get the benefit up to Movement 9, which is much better, obviously, than Movement 7, especially for a primarily melee unit. They also have a better weapon skill, ballistic skill of 3+, which is very impressive, although their other stats are basically the same. They do have the option for a unit champion. Theirs is called the Anchorite, and it has a 3+ armor save instead of any other benefit, which is, I think, really interesting place to be for a unit champion. Most of the time, you get +1 attack, +1 leadership out of those. This is +1 save, and I actually think that's pretty... it goes a little bit of the way towards making the unit less, easy to kill. These Mortifiers do not have a 5+ damage ignore. They have a 6+ damage ignore, but having that +1 save available to you to take small arms fire on sort of makes up for that a little bit. Not quite as much. I'd much rather have a 5+ damage ignore, but at least, you can have 3+ saves on these ladies. Additionally, they have some additional options for their ranged weapons. Like the Penitent Engine, they can take 2 heavy flamers. However, you can, for the exact same cost, exchange those for heavy bolters. And with the new heavy bolter profile, that is an impressive stat line to have on these things. In addition, have this rule, Blaze of Agony, which allows you, if you so desire, to fire your heavy bolters at Assault 3 if you advance. Now, they also get the option to advance and charge, being Adepta Sororitas keyworded, unlike the Penitent Engines, which means that a lot of times you will want to advance with this unit. And heavy bolters are a much more flexible weapon than a heavy flamer, since they have a longer range. So you'll probably be able to fire that heavy bolter every time. So not only are you getting these better keywords, you're getting the Adepta Sororitas keyword out of this Mortifier unit. You get the option to increase to a 3+ armor save, but also you get a really reasonable shooting profile out of them as well, in addition to some extra speed. So they can advance up the table, fire their heavy bolters hitting on 4s. That's not amazing, but heavy bolters are in a really good place right now. -1 AP for 2 damage is really good. It's good at killing those sort of medium infantry, like Space Marine infantry. They're good at tuning up vehicles a little bit. And if you're bringing large units of them, we should mention as well that you can take up to 4 in a unit. If you're bringing large units of them, that's 24 heavy bolter shots coming out of them for no additional cost. So, that's going to add up. Now, they also have a little bit of an additional ability. They can sort of, I guess, selectively explode if they're killed in combat with somebody. They, on a 4+ hits somebody for D3 mortal wounds within an inch of them, which is pretty cool. They don't explode normally, so they don't damage your own army when they die. They can only ever damage enemies, which is pretty cool, although you do have to be engaged. But that is pretty good since this is an aggressive unit that wants to be sticking it into your opponent's face, and dealing some additional damage when they die is pretty solid as well. Now, all that all sounds pretty good, and all that for just 10 points more than the Penitent Engine. They're 30 points base instead of 20. They still pay the same for the weapons, so they come out at 60 points instead of 50. But on top of that, you know, you get everything we talked about before. You get better guns. You get these extra cool abilities. You get the ability to advance and shoot and advance in charge. You get the Adepta Sororitas keyword, which opens up a whole swath of stratagems and abilities you can use on them. It's just great. It's just money. Now, the one downside that mortifiers have is that they are weapon skill 3, and while that is technically better than the Penitent Engine's weapon skill of 4, they don't have the Zealot special rule. So they don't get rerolls to hit when they charge, and there's not really any way to source rerolls for them, so you're just sort of rolling raw with the mortifiers on that 3+ weapon skill. That said, weapon skill 3, I mean, that's where most combat stuff is at, so it's probably fine. It's just not super exciting. Now, unfortunately, while they do have this Adepta Sororitas keyword, mortifiers also don't have any of the Adepta Sororitas abilities for some reason. So again, no rites of battle, no shield of faith, no acts of faith, none of that. They also don't have an order keyword, which is kind of confusing to me, to be honest. So they do not get subfaction abilities, and they don't get a lot of those subfaction auras that we just talked about, like Canonesses and Imagifiers. So that's weird, but at least they get that Adepta Sororitas keyword. Now, both of these units have 2 weapon options. They are the Buzz Blade, which is just a big old circular saw you use to chop your opponents up into little tiny bits, and they also have the Penitent Flail, and these are both pretty interesting weapon profiles. The Buzz Blade comes in at sort of a Power Fist profile almost. It's +3 strength for -3 AP to flat damage, so it's coming in at a base strength of 8. And for both these weapons, they get an additional attack if you equip both of the same weapon onto them, which you probably should be doing most of the time. The Flails are an interesting profile as well. They come in at +1 strength, -2 AP, 1 damage, so strength 6, -2 AP, but only 1 damage. However, they make 3 hit rolls for each attack made with the weapon. Now, how this works is that it basically triples the number of attacks you make. It is worded sort of weird. You'd think that they would just say that, you know, you make 3 attacks for every 1 attack instead, but the way that the 9th edition attack sequence works, this makes a lot more sense, because essentially an attack converts directly to a hit roll, which converts directly to a wound roll. So just having them convert attacks into hit rolls saves a lot of time, but it is a little confusing. So any new players coming in looking at this, that verbiage just means that you're going to triple the number of attacks you make. So if they're coming in with their base 4 attacks, 5 if they're equipped with 2 flails, that means you're going to roll 15 dice to hit and then convert those into wound rolls, so you could potentially wound 15 times and all that. So those are much better at threshing infantry, obviously, and that is, I think, an important thing to note in the metagame right now. That style of model, or models that are susceptible to this type of attack, are very popular right now. I mean, it's mostly Harlequins. Harlequins are kind of killing everybody, so being able to attack them a whole boatload of times to get through their invulnerable saves is pretty good. So now we've talked about the profiles. These units are pretty straightforward. I mean, they're very melee focused. The mortifiers do have guns, but a lot of their damage is dealt in melee, and they can advance and shoot. So they both want to be moving up the table as quickly as possible, getting stuck in, and really just, you know, throwing themselves onto the opponent's lines. They're a lot different style of melee unit than others that Sororitas have access to. A lot of Sororitas lists, I mean, most of them use Repentia right now, and Repentia are very much a glass cannon. They need to be protected and sort of babied up the board, but once they get there, they're going to do a lot more damage. The Mortifiers and Penitent Engines trade a lot of their damage output instead for survivability. They're not super survivable. The toughness 4 with a 4+ save is not, or toughness 5, excuse me, is not good. That's a bad stat line, but it's better than, you know, toughness 3 with a 5+ damage ignore and a 6+ invulnerable. They also, being vehicles, you know, come in with some built-in downsides as well. They eat extra damage from things like haywire a lot. They can't go through breachable terrain, you know, all that's the stuff that comes with being a vehicle, but fortunately they make up for it a little bit in their long movement. So moving over to some synergies that you can use alongside your Penitent Engines or Mortifiers, but let's be real, mostly your Mortifiers. There are a couple that benefit both unit types. The first one is Desperate for Redemption, the 3 CP double fight strat that Sisters of Battle have access to. It is only usable on Penitent Engines, Mortifiers, and Repentia. So that's the only way that Sisters have access to a double fight, and, you know, 2/3 of it is through these units. So that's pretty good. There are also a couple sort of keywordless buffs that you can affect them with. Celestine has an aura to give any Adeptus Ministorum units a 6+ invulnerable save, which is going to be super useful for them. Also, Celestine's in basically every list ever, so that's going to be easy to get. Missionaries can stop them from running away. They do have a high leadership. They are leadership 8, but if you're taking 4 and you lose 3, it is possible for the last one to run away. That's not really a big synergy, but it exists. Unfortunately, Missionaries, their aura for +1 attack only affects infantry, and these are vehicles, so they won't be affected by that. And last but not least, the Relic Casket of Penance can give things -1 toughness, which can then be punched by a Mortifier. It's not really a big synergy, but it does exist, so we're going to talk about it. Now, the Mortifier itself has that Adepta Sororitas keyword, and that gives it access to a whole bunch of stratagems, which you can use on it, which is pretty good. First off, Judgment of the Faithful allows it to fall back and do stuff, so it can fall back and shoot and charge. Pretty good. Movement of Grace allows you to sort of pseudo use Acts of Faith to pass saving throws. You get to dump miracle dice to add to your saving throw rolls. Not a big deal. Usually you save that for characters, but it is a way that these units could potentially use miracle dice. Suffer Not the Witch to Live gives you rerolls against Psychers, which is pretty good as well. And last but certainly not least, I think the most important stratagem on this list is Holy Rage, which you can use in the charge phase to charge after you advance. This is awesome on Mortifiers, not only because their movement is really fast. Movement 9 plus D6 for advancing is a pretty decent threat range, but they also want to be advancing all the time to use their heavy bolter, their special heavy bolter roll anyway, so they don't really lose any damage output from that. Penitent Engines obviously do not have access to this and are 2 inches slower movement, which is a little bit disappointing, so they are going to be left quite in the dust pretty hardcore. Now, we do have a couple questions that we want answers to when comparing these data sheets. First off, which weapon should you take? The difference between the flails and the buzzsaws is a pretty big deal. The flails make a whole boatload more attacks. The buzzsaws are much more effective. And interestingly, I think to me, both of their stat lines are pretty impressive, at least in the metagame right now. The flails getting up to strength 6 is a really big deal because that's kind of a break point where you want to hit toughness 5, sort of heavy infantry really hard, or toughness 3-ish Harlequin stuff that punches that pretty good too. So being strength 6 on the flail is a pretty big deal. And also strength 8 on the buzzsaw is also pretty good because that hits, most vehicles are toughness 7, so that gets them down to wounding on 3s. Now, in order to do this comparison, I did a lot of math. I did a ton, and I made an Excel sheet. So I'm just going to put the Excel sheet up here so I don't have to rewrite the entire thing. It's going to look a little messy to everybody, but I do apologize because there's a lot of sort of analysis to do here. The first thing I asked is, should you take flails or should you take buzzsaws? And it's interesting because I think the 2 weapons are balanced pretty appropriately. Now, for this analysis, I have added the damage output of the heavy bolters into the Mortifier's damage because I assume that the Mortifier will be able to advance and fire those heavy bolters either at whatever it's charging or at something else, and it's going to accrue that damage against your opponent's army over the course of the game. Whereas the Penitent Engine here, so the Mortifier is going to be a little bit higher. Also, the Mortifier can fire its heavy bolters earlier, so the Penitents may get one round of shooting the Flamers, but unfortunately the Mortifiers can just do that every turn, so it will eventually add up, I think, to be greater than the Flamethrowers. So there's probably a little bit of extra damage that we're losing here on the Penitents, but also I think the Mortifiers would get a couple extra rounds of shooting to make up for that, so I think the analysis is pretty reasonable. The flails obviously are much better against guardsman equivalent sort of light infantry, as we can see here. The flails plus the heavy bolter shots doing almost 10 expected damage, so like a single mortifier will kill an entire guardsman squad by itself, essentially. Versus Marines, they start to fall off a little bit because you do have to do twice as many wounds to them, but their damage output is still pretty reasonable. You're killing 4 or 5-ish a piece between the Penitents and the Mortifiers, and that's where their heavy bolter starts to really add up. The heavy bolter actually accounts for an entire Marine worth of damage. However, versus vehicles and knights, their profile actually mass out identically, so they're only going to be doing between 2 and 3 damage. Now, obviously, the Mortifier here, looking at the points per wound or kill, Versus Guardsman equivalents and Marine equivalents, I'm calculating the number of kills that they're able to make. The flails are very efficient against Guardsmen, being between 5 and 6 points. However, versus Marines, they remain relatively efficient, between 10 and 11 points once they get into melee. They fall off a lot against vehicles. Now, obviously, the Mortifier in all of these cases is slightly less efficient than the Penitent Engine, but I think that's because you're paying a lot for that Adepta Sororitas keyword. The one thing you have to keep in mind is that the Mortifier's threat range is going to be probably like half again as much as the Penitent Engine. The Penitent Engine is just 7 plus 2d6 is its maximum threat range, so it's probably going 14. However, the Mortifier is 9 plus 3d6, so it's probably going around 20 inches. So you're trading some level of points efficiency for additional threat range, which I think is a very important trade-off. One thing I also haven't mathed up in here is the extra D3 mortals that mortifiers do when they die in melee. Looking over at the buzzsaws, however, the story gets pretty interesting. Versus Guardsman equivalents, also, obviously, we're not doing much damage at all. You get to convert your attacks highly, and actually here we see the mortifiers, be able to pull a little bit ahead because its heavy bolters are also putting in work, but it's not super efficient, and you're only getting 7 or 8 points per expected kill there. Versus Marines, though, it starts to bump up a little bit. We're looking between 5 and 5.5 expected wounds for the buzzsaws into them. That 2 flat damage, really doing a lot of work. And versus vehicles, things actually get way better. We're looking at 4-ish damage apiece, between 4 and 4.5 damage per mortifier into a toughness 7 vehicle. Versus knights, they're actually identical. They end up just being the same, but that +1 to wound against toughness 7 vehicles is a real big deal from being strength 8. And we can also see that the heavy bolters start to put in some work moving up to the upper echelons of targets. We can see that at least for the knight equivalent units, the damage from the mortifier actually becomes slightly more efficient than the damage from a Penitent Engine. So that comes down to the ultimate question: which weapon should you take? Now, this is actually a really interesting question, because going into this, I thought that the flails were just going to beat out the buzzsaws wholeheartedly, single-handedly. Just tripling your attacks is going to be way better than having 2 flat damage. But when you look at the math, they actually come a lot closer than I expected. Now, it is highly meta-dependent. If you're fighting 2 wounds, sort of medium infantry that Space Marines are bringing, intercessors or tactical Marines or stuff like that, or you're fighting big blocks of toughness 7 vehicles, things like Adeptus Mechanicus and factions of those ilk, the buzzsaws are going to do way more for you than the flail. However, if you're approaching the meta from a competitive standpoint, 2 of the most important factions you have to deal with in the meta right now are Harlequins and Sisters of Battle, and both of them bring high volumes of toughness 3 infantry, not many of which really care about high AP. So having those flails available to you to wound those guys on 2s and having a high volume of attacks to get through those invulnerable saves, especially for Harlequins, is going to be a lot better, is going to make those flails a lot better in those particular cases. So I actually think it comes down to a question of what you're playing against. Generally speaking, I think personally I would angle towards the buzzsaws, because I think in a wider variety of very common matchups, they tend to be a little bit more efficient. However, if you're looking at the top factions in the meta right now, the flails are going to do you a lot better. So I guess the answer is magnetize your models, and then just do both. Switch them out, depending on what's good in the metagame at the time. Now, talking about the final verdict, are mortifiers and or Penitent Engines good for your list? And the answer is yes for mortifiers, no for Penitent Engines. Get those Penitent Engines out of there right now. They're bad. I think you probably picked up on this as the video went on, but Penitent Engines just have so many downsides compared to mortifiers that it's not really, I don't think it's really worth considering them in the contrast. While they may be slightly more damage efficient per point in a lot of situations, Penitent Engines just have the issue that they're just not going to get there. They're just not going to get delivered. They move 7 inches, they can't advance and charge. They have no synergies whatsoever with the rest of your army besides some very specific stratagems, whereas mortifiers can use a lot of the existing Adepta Sororitas infrastructure and stratagems and synergize a lot better with your army. On top of that, they can be delivered with extra movement and the ability to potentially advance in charge with Holy Rage. And on top of that, they have really good guns. Their shooting is really good, especially since the buff to heavy bolters has gone through and made them put out just an immense fusillade of 2 damage shooting. Now, they are heavy support options, so they are competing directly with a couple other very popular choices in the Sororitas faction, those being Exorcists, which honestly have sort of fallen out of favor lately, so I actually don't think you're going to see many Exorcists these days. But the big one is Retributor squads, and a lot of Adepta Sororitas builds are centering around the castle of 3 Retributor squads with Junis Eruita to give them rerolls to hit, and they're very efficient. Long-range damage, being able to use Miracle Dice to force and, big hits through on those multi-multi shots is very good. And Mortifiers directly compete for slots in your battalion with those. Now, that said, Mortifiers do fill a much different role, and they can actually offer you sort of additional ways to deal damage in melee that aren't just Sisters Repentia. I think most lists in Sororitas should probably still build around 3 units of Sisters Repentia, but being able to slot Mortifiers in there to back up the Repentia, to be able to shoot as they're, moving into melee, and support them, once you're getting into melee, since their threat range is going to be not too different. Like, you could sort of lead the charge with the Repentia, and then follow up with the Mortifiers later after a couple of turns of shooting with heavy bolters. A list like that is very effective. So it really depends on what the direction of Sororitas list you want to go in, but I do think Mortifiers are going to be a good option if you're looking for a little bit more of an aggressive and slightly more resilient unit that doesn't just sort of immediately vaporize as soon as they leave their transports. Now, I'm adding this a little bit after the fact, but we actually just had a game on stream. You can follow the stream over at twitch.tv/tacticaltortoisetv. Right now, we're doing all of our streaming over there, and we just played the T5S2 Season 2 Rapid Fire 3 Finals, which happened to be between 2 Adepta Sororitas lists, one bringing 3 units of Mortifiers, one bringing 3 units of Retributors, and the rest of the lists were almost identical. So we really got to see the 2 units in action, and the Mortifiers did great. They exactly did their job. They picked up a lot of very important units in shooting on the way in. They sort of acted as linebackers for the Repentia squads that were going in, and they were very impressive. I liked seeing them in action, and it really showcased the power of those Mortifiers. So I'll put a link to that video down in the video description if you want to take a look at that out. I highly recommend it. It's a super fun game between 2 awesome players who are around the top of the T5S2 ladder right now. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this datasheet deep dive. This has been a really interesting one. I racked my brain for ages before recording this video of how I was going to compare the 2, because a lot of doing the comparisons of a lot of the Space Marine units, it's like the same unit with a different gun. But the Penitent versus the Mortifier has so many baked-in, like, slight differences. Their weapons are identical. They just have the same weapons, but their combat stats are slightly different. Their keywords are slightly different. They just have like these so many little tiny changes that it makes it very interesting to compare the 2. As always, big thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel. If you want to submit your suggestions for Datasheet Deep Dive, you can head on over to patreon.com/tacticaltortoise and join them. Otherwise, thanks again for watching. Remember to, like and subscribe and do all that YouTube stuff. You know the drill. And remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.